Hi there, my name is Ayala Connell and I'm a gluten-free and paleo chef, and this is an episode of Simply Paleo with me. Today we're going to be learning how to make chocolate chip cookies the paleo way. So what's interesting is most paleo baking recipes use almond flour, coconut flour. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people with nut sensitivities out there that are trying to learn how to have a less inflammatory diet. So it took me a bit, but we came up with a recipe in my chemistry kitchen trying to figure out the best flours to use to create a paleo cookie recipe that doesn't have any nuts in it. So here we go. And it's a pretty simple recipe. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by putting in some of the liquid ingredients. And there's a lot of chemistry that goes into creating the perfect cookie, and there's definitely been a lot of trial and error in my kitchen. And so this is what I came up with. So the recipe is below this video, so you can check that out on simplypaleo.com on the food blog under the chocolate chip cookie recipe. So what we're going to do is put 1/3 of a cup of olive oil in. And you can use other types of oil, but it's ideal to use an oil that's healthy. And I try to get an olive oil that is from a reputable company. So I know that it's going to be good quality, but also not an overly robust olive oil, so that the olive oil flavor isn't going to necessarily impart a huge change in the cookie. And then we're going to put in the sweetener, the liquid sweetener. So we're going to put in 1/3 of a cup of maple syrup. You can certainly use honey as well. It's going to darken the color of the cookies a little bit, which is fine, because these are sort of pretty blonde. And then what we're going to do is put a little bit of vanilla in. So we're going to do about 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla. All right. And that is definitely an important ingredient when making cookies to give it that nice vanilla flavor. And then what we're going to do is we're going to whisk the oil and the sweetener. Now, if you have an electric mixer, which is a great way to do this as well, then I would just put these ingredients in and then whisk it up until you can get the fat coating the sweetener. Okay, and then we're going to add in the flour, and it helps to make the moisture life of the cookie longer by coating the flour with the oil as well, with the fat. So we're going to have this in very specific ingredient order. We're not going to just throw all the ingredients in. So this is nice and thick, the mixture. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our flour mix. Now in here we have 1/2 cup of cassava flour. Now cassava flour is a grain-free, paleo-friendly flour that's also nut-free. It's made from the cassava root. Now many of you are familiar, certainly in the world of gluten-free, you're familiar with tapioca starch. Tapioca starch is actually the starch that is removed from the cassava root. So the cassava flour is actually the whole root flour, and it's a fantastic flour. So we have 1/2 cup of that in here. We also have 1/3 cup of arrowroot powder and 1/3 cup of tapioca starch, and that creates our base. And we have 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of sea salt in here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put in all the dry ingredients, and we're going to coat the flour in the fat and the sweetener, and we're just going to mix it up until we've got it nice and mixed and a nice thick cookie texture. And then the last ingredient we're going to put in before we fold in the chocolate chips is the egg. Now we're getting to a point here where this is kind of a thick batter, so I'm going to actually start to use my spatula, which I could have done in the beginning, but I had the whisk in here anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And so we're just going to get all the batter off, and we're just going to keep mixing. Now the electric mixer of course does this a little bit easier, but I'm doing it in a large bowl for you to show you that it really can be done anywhere, on the go. As long as you have the ingredients in a bowl and a spoon, you're good. Good to go. Now, I also preheated the oven to 350 degrees, and I lined a baking sheet with parchment paper. If you have a Silpat, which is sort of a silicone sheet that can line the pan, that's good too. It's great for making cookies, and the idea is then the cookies don't stick. But certainly you can also grease a baking sheet, but I find it works better when you use parchment paper. Okay, so now we'll set this aside. We'll grab our egg and let's move this out of the way. We're going to need our whisk again. And we're going to crack the egg and beat it first. Okay. And then you can also use just a little fork for this. It doesn't really matter. But we're just going to quickly beat it just to get a good consistency. And then we're going to pour it into our batter. And we're going to mix it up some more. It's a nice simple recipe. This of course is much quicker in the KitchenAid, but again it's so easy to do it in a bowl as well. Now the egg is definitely going to make the batter a little less thick and more of a wet batter. So typically what I do, and this is the case when doing any sort of gluten-free baking, it's always helpful after you make a batter of something, before you put it in the oven, to chill it. And so you can either put it in the fridge for like a half an hour, or you can put it in the freezer for 5 or 10 minutes just to get the, especially with a cookie batter, to get it nice and chilled. Now we're not going to do that today, just for essence of time, but it creates a batter that then doesn't run as easily on the baking sheet. Although even if it does, that's okay too if you don't have the time. So we've created a batter, and you can see it's a little bit wetter, but it's still relatively thick, okay? And now what we're going to do is we're going to take our chocolate chunks and we're going to fold them in. Now, chocolate chunks, you can buy chocolate chips that are naturally sweetened. You can get a naturally sweetened chocolate bar and chop it up into chunks. There's a great company called Hue Kitchen that has delicious chocolate bars. Their simple chocolate is a good one. It's sweetened with coconut sugar. But it's also really simple to make your own chocolate. And that's another recipe for another day, but just to give you a clue, I'll create a double boiler, or if you have a double boiler, or you just take a heat sustaining glass bowl or a metal bowl and you situate it over a saucepan that has some water in it. You don't want the water to hit the bowl. And then you turn it up so that the water starts to boil and heats the bottom of the bowl. And then what you do is you put cocoa butter in. The cocoa butter is the fat from the chocolate. So it looks like chocolate in texture, but it's entirely blonde. And it doesn't have any sweetness, it just has the texture of chocolate. So you melt that and you add in some cocoa powder, a little bit of vanilla, a pinch of salt, and some maple syrup or honey. Get it into a nice smooth consistency. And then what you do is you pour it over parchment paper on a baking sheet, put it in the freezer for a little bit until it hardens, and then you just chop it up into chunks, put it in a freezer bag, and in the freezer it goes. It's really simple. But again, I'll get the specifics, the refined recipe, for another post. So we've got our chocolate chunks that are super delicious, and we're just going to sprinkle them in here. All different sizes. This is not, French pastry making. And what we're going to do is we're going to fold in the chocolate chips. Now when you're folding in ingredients, it means you don't just do this with your spoon to mix it. You're really sort of folding things over so that you don't overbeat the batter or sort of destroy the texture of the ingredients that you're folding in. All right. And then we are going to be ready to put it on the parchment paper. All right, it's nice and folded. And what I like to do is use an ice cream scooper, and there's lots of different sizes. This is a smaller one, almost like a melon ball scooper, to scoop out the batter and put it on the baking sheet. It makes it easier. But I have parchment paper already in here. And what I'm going to do is just do 3 rows. I'm going to do rows of 3, probably 4 or 5 rows. And I don't want to make them too close together. If it's chilled, once you put the mounds onto the baking sheet, you'll probably need to use your finger or a fork with a little bit of wetness and pat it down a little bit each one to make them more into a flatter cookie shape. But when it's a little bit wetter like this, it should be okay. And we're just going to put 1. Now we're going to put them a couple inches apart. You can also make smaller cookies and use a smaller ice cream scooper, or you can just use 2 teaspoons. 1 teaspoon to get up the batter and the other one to kind of push it off so your hands aren't completely covered, although that's never a bad thing. Of course, there's raw egg in here, but still, we've all been known. So now we're just going to get these on, and then we'll put this in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for, I like to do 18 minutes. If you like them to be a little bit softer, you can do 15 minutes and then check them, or even less time. And then I suggest letting them cool on the baking sheet a little bit, and then you can put them onto a cooling rack, enjoy them while they're hot, warm, or let them cool entirely. It makes a really delicious, almost shortbready consistency type of cookie. But we'll have some to taste test in just a moment. And we got our second to last cookie, and this batter makes a really good amount for this baking sheet. So you can see they're kind of like mounds. You can certainly flatten them down a little bit more if you prefer, or you can leave them like that and they'll probably flatten out a little bit in the oven. Anyway, so this goes in at 350 degrees. Now we're just going to set it aside. I'll put it in the oven shortly. And then we're going to try some cookies. So we've got a bowl here of delicious chocolate chunk cookies. So you can see the chunks throughout. We'll break it in half so you can see the texture. There's a beautiful texture that's nice and moist, but also not so moist that it's cakey. It definitely has a cookie consistency. And let's take a bite that has some chocolate in it. You can see the chocolate chunks throughout. Okay, let's give it a try. So good. The texture is so delicious. It has a little bit of that shortbready consistency. The sweetness is not overpowering. Of course, you've got the dark chocolate, which has its own inherent sweetness. It's delicious. And then the sweetness of the cookie is not completely overpowering. You can taste a little bit of that vanilla accent as well. But if you want it to be sweeter, you can certainly add more sweetener to it. And then I would suggest chilling the batter so it doesn't run too much if there's more liquid in it. But it's just so yummy and a great cookie to give your kiddos, or a late night snack, or just because, or a celebratory thing. Maybe you have a cookie swap happening. People that happen to be gluten-free in the room will be so excited to have cookies. So I recommend you try this recipe. It's so easy. It's really delicious. And you really don't need a ton of ingredients. And so you can get the recipe on my blog at simplypaleo.com on the food blog. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. Any questions that you have, or comments about the recipe, or how they turned out for you. And of course, any sort of cravings or wish lists of things you'd love to learn how to make in more of a paleo way. Please check me out on my blog at simplypaleo.com. And thanks so much for tuning in to the Simply Paleo Kitchen.